Hi, everyone. It's Rev Kimmy. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'm Dr. G, and we have a special guest with us today. And we're going to talk about John Wayne Gacy, the clown, the killer clown. Incredible story that we have for you today. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, murdered 33 boys and young men, burying most of them in the crawl space under his Chicago home. In high school at that time, Karen Conti was home watching the bodies being removed on national television. I vaguely remember that. And today, folks, we have Karen with us to talk about her experiences with John Wayne Gacy and her new book, Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy. Karen, welcome to our show.
It's so nice to be here and talk to you, Dr. G and Rev Kimmy.
Thank you.
Thank you. So start with, and this is interesting for folks because we need a little background. How did we get up to this? I mean, to represent such a monster like this, how did you always have an interest in law? How did you become a lawyer? And did you do criminal right from the get-go?
So I always wanted to be a lawyer. I think what I really wanted to do is to be a politician back in the days of John Kennedy and all of that in the 60s. And, I would never think to be a politician today, of course, but I thought that my route would be to get a really good education and a legal education at that. But I never thought about doing criminal work. I never thought that was going to be something I did. I didn't think one way or the other about it. When I was in law school, I enjoyed my criminal classes, but I always thought that I'd probably be on the civil side. So when I started out as a lawyer, I worked for a large law firm. I did very high-end civil litigation, and I did no criminal work whatsoever. I eventually became a partner with another gentleman who he was, he did both criminal and civil. So when the call came from Gacy, we were doing criminal work to some extent, but certainly nothing that was anywhere near a death penalty case.
Oh, that kind of answers part of my next question then, because in teaching, I get students who come through and all they talk about is serial killers and they want to be a profiler, or they talk about doing immigration law, or, they're very focused. Did you have an interest in serial killers or any kind of background knowledge before being contacted by him?
Yeah, actually I did. When I was a kid, I was very interested in the Jack the Rippers, and my dad and I used to read the books, and we, debate who really was Jack the Ripper. I remember Lizzie Borden was a big part of my childhood, reading about her, and I actually went to her house, which is a tourist attraction out east. So, yes, I've always had a real interest in serial killers, and even when I was a lawyer, I read all the books, the Ted Bundy books and Jeffrey Dahmer. I had read everything about Gacy, and so I was mostly interested in the psychology of what creates somebody like these people.
Oh, so you actually had, without knowing where you were headed in life, you actually had pretty good preparation going.
I did, and I think that, when the call came in for us to go meet him, I was so curious. I had really no intention of representing him. I didn't know one way or the other. I was just curious because here's a person who I had read about over and over again. I had read his psychology reports, and I had read about his victims. And when you grow up in Chicago, he's the boogeyman. I mean, when I was 15 years old, Gacy was arrested. So, I mean, he was the guy that, you didn't, get into his car, and parents told you, otherwise you're going to end up like Gacy's victims. So, all of those things were part of my childhood. And so when I got the call, I couldn't pass it up. I had to look evil in the eye.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about there. Growing up as a kid, our boogeyman was Ed Gein. People would always talk about Ed Gein. And it's like, he'll get you if you're bad and you're out after dark.
So at that point, were you scared?
No, I wasn't scared, and maybe I should have been. Maybe it was just naivete. But I knew from all my reading that Gacy was compartmentalized, so that I knew he wasn't going to just, kill me. You know,
Yeah.
I was going to go on death row, and he was going to just lose it and kill me. First of all, I was not his type. Second of
that
all,
makes sense.
he was a person who walked through life, you know, as an upstanding citizen. He volunteered at hospitals. He had a good job. He made a lot of money. He went to church. You know, here was a guy who lived a life. He raised children. He was a good husband, and yet he went out at night and did these horrible crimes. So I knew that Gacy was going to contain himself. And really, when I went to death row, I thought it was going to be one of those plexiglass cubicles where he was going to be on one side and I was going to be on the other, which turns out it wasn't like that at all.
Oh, yeah, that was, when I went to see Rodney Reed, he was on the other side of glass talking to me with a phone.
Yeah, no, when I walked into death row, you are locked into a bullpen with all of the people on death row who are visiting with their ministers, their lawyers, their girlfriends, their family, and so they're all walking around free range.
Oh,
and
my
so
goodness.
I, as a lawyer, you know, when you're a lawyer and you do some criminal defense work, you know who all these killers are. You know, you're like, oh, there's the I-57 killer. Here's the guy who eats body parts. Here's the guy who poisoned his whole family. So
Oh,
like,
my
you know,
goodness.
You're looking around, and so those people were a little more daunting because those people were maybe not as contained and compartmentalized
Right.
as Gacy,
Oh, my
and
gosh.
unmedicated, and probably nothing left to lose being on death row. So it's not the kind of thing where you turn your back to the door.
Oh,
Oh,
my
my
Those people.
goodness.
Goodness. Yeah, I was imagining, you know, from my experience, and then I thought, well, you know, maybe I watch TV too much, but I was thinking it'd be like the old days where they tether the elephants at the circus to the ground with a chain, and I'm thinking, well, maybe they shackled him to the floor or something so that he couldn't jump at her, and Karen could, you know, jump back and get away from him. But you're saying these guys are just in there walking around free range like chickens in the yard?
Yeah, I mean, they're handcuffed, you know, but again, that's not of any comfort to me because handcuffs can also be
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
weapon.
Yeah,
So,
in front of him, handcuffed in front of him.
In front.
Oh
In
my
front,
goodness!
yeah.
So they can choke you out if they wanted to.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah. But,
That's-
you know, Gacy just wasn't scary. He, you know, and the other part about this is, as you
Interesting.
know, as you both know, the psychotic person, the sociopathic personality, they are all about using people as pawns. Everybody in their world is a pawn to get what they want.
Yeah.
And their only goal is to get what they want. And so I was of value to Gacy, you know, in a number of ways. So he wasn't going to hurt me. That would have been stupid for him to do so. So, and at this point in his life, he was institutionalized. You know, he was not killing young men and boys. He was living his life and trying to save his life. So I was not going to be a person he was going to harm.
Uh-huh. That makes perfect sense. I've talked to folks who were nurses going into prisons, and they said the same thing, that the inmates were extremely polite to them and everything because they could write them medications and all, you know, do all kinds of nice things for them. Yeah.
Exactly. And,
Okay.
and they can mimic very social behavior. Gacy was very engaging. He was very funny. He was very charming. He could be very kind, you know, in his demeanor. I'm not saying he was a kind person. I'm saying that he could act in a way that would lead you to believe that he was a good person. And this is obviously why he got away with 33 and not just one and done.
So he kind of mirrored Ted Bundy, didn't he? Ted Bundy was charming too. Exactly everything you just explained.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say Ted Bundy was probably a little bit more polished than Gacy. Gacy was not educated like Bundy. He didn't speak with the Queen's English. You know, he was
Right.
kind of these, thems, and those kinds of guy. But he was like your uncle. He was like the uncle that, you know, sits on the lazy boy and watches television. And, you know, he was, you know, in his own right, charming and affable.
Huh.
Yeah, last night we listened to his the Gacy tapes on Netflix, and so we could hear him, you know, and he's exactly what you're describing. He seems like he's intelligent. I mean, he doesn't sound like honors roll, but he doesn't sound dumb.
Yeah.
No, I think he was intelligent, and I think he was also astute as to who his audience was at any given time. And he was very good at mimicking what people wanted to hear.
Oh.
And then he could elicit information from you. He could give back what you wanted to hear, and in so doing, he was very good at being manipulative.
Oh,
It sounds like it.
Okay. Listen, I'm curious. Did he have another attorney that was working with him, or how did he find you? How did you end up representing him? And I know people listening to us, they've got to be shaking their head just in disbelief that how could anybody represent John Wayne Gacy, such a prolific killer? I mean, how is it? I mean, how do you do that, and how did you come to be his representative?
So my law partner and I had a really interesting practice at the time. We had argued before the United States Supreme Court on a First Amendment issue, and it was very well publicized. And so Gacy had been sued by the prison civilly because in our state there's a law that says that if you're capable of paying for your incarceration, then the criminal has to pay. And Gacy was doing a lot of artwork, and Gacy thought, why are you suing me? You're also going to execute me. I want to fight this. And, and so we were he viewed this as a First Amendment right to do his paintings. So we were on the list of First Amendment lawyers. His family and friends on the outside were instructed to call us, and they called us, and we said, okay, we'll go down and meet him, with absolutely no idea that we were going to get involved in anything, including the civil case, and especially not the death penalty case.
Oh, that's interesting.
It was really just a trip for curiosity purposes. And when we got down there, I think my partner and I both, who were really against the death penalty from the get-go, realized that this was bigger than Gacy. This was one of the first executions that was going to happen in a number of years because there was a moratorium on the death penalty in the country for a period of time. And that once they started executing Gacy, then they were going to start executing all the other people on death row. And while Gacy did not have good defenses of actual innocence, he wasn't a person of color, and he certainly had competent counsel throughout his criminal justice process. He didn't have those traditional arguments that some of the other death row inmates have. But I knew that this was going to be something that we needed to take seriously, and I wanted to speak out against the death penalty. I wanted to try to move the public opinion about that, even for someone like Gacy, even for someone as evil and horrible and lacking in remorse as Gacy, that everyone, deserves to live. It doesn't deter, and making all those arguments on the anti-death penalty. So when we got down there, we just realized we want to be on this death row case. We forget the civil case. We can resolve that simply. But I want to do something important, and I don't believe in the death penalty, and this is probably the most public case in Illinois' history. Why not get involved and try to do something like save his life?
Yeah. So the ultimate goal then was not necessarily to get him freed from prison, but just spare him from execution.
Never. Right. No, that was never going to happen. That was never our goal. It was impossible. The key was we wanted to really just stop the execution and make our arguments that the death penalty as implemented is cruel and unusual, and all the other arguments that we made along the way.
Okay. Did he think he should be free?
No, actually. I had a conversation with him about that. I was joking with him about him being on the outside and going to a party that I was throwing for my law partner, and I said, "Oh, John, you being out, you being invited, that's not going to happen." And he was laughing, and he said, I would never want to walk out of here. I said, "Really?" He said, "If you could walk out today, you wouldn't walk out?" He said, "No." And we went on to talk, and I read between the lines, and I think what he was saying to me was that, without saying it, that, at the end, right before he got arrested, he was really escalating. He, like many serial killers, he needed more and more to kind of fuel these evil urges. So I think it was really stressful on him, and I think he wasn't lacking in remorse, but I think it was too much for him, and he wanted to get caught. And when he was caught, I think it was a relief for him to not have those urges anymore. And I think he liked his life in prison because he couldn't do those crimes, and it was just too much for him, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, they either, I've noticed that in my studies, as a criminal justice professor, that the murders either become closer together or they'll increase in violence from just a beating to dismemberment. And I'm looking at his, and there's a great big gap at the beginning, but towards the end there, he's doing like 2, 3 every other month.
There was one night he did 3 in one night.
Yeah, it's just...
So he would go out, troll for a kid, come back, kill him, go back out. So,
oh my goodness.
It's unbelievable.
Wow, I didn't know that.
He was.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm still just blown away by the fact that they're just roaming around in there with you. That I've done interviews with gang members, and I felt on edge, and watch my 6 and everything else. But I couldn't imagine being in the room with multiple people like that.
That's
good Lord,
that's a nightmare.
That's worse than a rodeo cowboy and a paddock full of bulls. Crazy. Hats off to you for that. Okay, let's see. What else did I have here?
Something I'm curious about. Now, recently I worked some cold cases in 2 states with the lead detectives on BTK Dennis Rader cases. And so I'm curious, when I saw some photos of his victims, and, I have never studied Gacy cases before. Was he also doing bind torture stuff like BTK, and he just didn't highlight it and naming himself like Dennis did?
Gacy would bind. He did this thing called the handcuff or the rope trick. He would do a trick.
Right, I heard that on.
He'd say to.
Mm-hmm. Last night I learned of that. Yeah.
So he would say to the kid, "Okay, now you want to try it yourself." And so he, put the handcuffs on him and said, "Well, the trick is that you don't get out." And so then he would, start torturing them. There was a board that he used where he would tie them down on a board. It was just horrific what he did. He was sadistic. He liked to inflict pain. He would, drown them to the point of almost death, and then
just like BTK did. Oh, okay. Because when I heard that last night, I'm like, this sounds like he did the same stuff. But he didn't highlight it in his name like BTK naming himself. Interesting.
Okay. And
so
wow.
As weird as all these people are,
yeah,
it's interesting that they're weird in the same way.
Yes, exactly.
The urges that drive them to do this are all, they all result in, not all, but there's different variations, of course, but the inflicting of pain and dominance on victims is really interesting because the psychiatrists and the profiles will tell you that this usually comes from a place of a person who was abused when they're young, they're beaten when they're young, they're feeling a place of powerlessness, which I'm not saying that anyone who was abused or beaten or, treated horribly turns into a serial killer. I'm not saying that at all. Most of them do not. But I think that at some point what the shrinks will tell you is that they start having fantasies of getting back at people and dominating somebody else and causing pain to somebody else. And somewhere along that line, the sexual urges get tied up into those fantasies. So now the fantasy is a sexual dominance issue. And so then these people need to, do this in order not only to just exact their revenge in their head, but also to be sexually gratified. And then at some point they can't even get sexually gratified unless they're killing or hurting or torturing somebody, which is so against what a normal brain does,
Yeah.
But and again, that doesn't excuse it, but it might explain it.
Yes.
Yeah. If you're still interested in that, I would suggest go look at the work by Adrian Rain. He's from the UK, but he was out at USC or UCLA or something like that doing PET scans of offenders, and their brains really do function differently. It's really, really interesting work that he did. Adrian Rain, R-A-I-N-E.
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
I also talk in my book about the idea that a lot of these serial killers and really horrific killers have had traumatic brain injuries. In fact, one study was on one state's death row. I believe all of them had serious head injuries.
Oh.
And they say
the frontal lobe?
Yeah, and there are two parts of the brain, apparently, that can be affected by, that can make someone violent, and one of them is the part of the brain that deals with empathy, because these psychopathic killers don't have empathy. They really, it's just they have no concern for the life of animals or for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part that sometimes gets damaged is the part that has impulse control. So while some
the
people
frontal
might
lobe,
have,
mm-hmm.
that they might have the same urges and the same fantasies, they have the impulse control to not act upon them. But these killers don't have that, because my guess is that nobody wants to be a serial killer. Nobody wants to go to jail. Nobody wants to do these things. But I do believe that people like Gacy and Dean and BTK, I think these people had uncontrollable urges to do these horrific things.
Huh. Well, they're kind of jumping ahead on my list of questions, but we're talking about his brain. I understand that was removed at autopsy, and it traveled around. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, the family agreed that a psychiatrist would examine the brain, and she did and found nothing at all abnormal.
Oh, my goodness.
And so I talk about that in my book, actually. Almost 30 years after she did it, she was trying to sell it to a horror museum for $1 million, we heard.
Oh.
So I had to
Did she succeed at
threaten
that?
a lawsuit to get it back, because the family was just so disgusted that their family members' body part was being sold.
Right.
So, that's interesting.
Oh, I can.
So assuming you succeeded on that case, the lawsuit?
That's so funny you say that, because it was the only victory that I had for Gacy.
Oh.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. I got the brain back, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've seen
Well, the evidence was so strong against him. How could you win on some issues, right?
So structurally, because I always talk to my students about the human, you have the hardware and the software, nature and nurture. And so hardware-wise, he had no structural deficiencies.
Right, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have something organic that was wrong with him from the beginning. That some part of his brain was not wired like the rest of us, right?
Right.
Because I got to know his family. His dad was not a nice guy. Was very domineering and harsh on him. But so he could have had some psychopathic issues or borderline personality or narcissism. But the rest of the family, by all accounts, were very human, kind, generous, normal, engaging, socially appropriate people. So, could Gacy have had something wired wrong from the beginning? Maybe. But I do think a lot of what happened to him over his childhood, he had been sexually abused. He obviously had issues with his sexuality. And so and his father's beatings of him and had trauma. I think all of those things could have contributed to what he became.
Yeah.
Did he ever kill animals when he was little?
He did not. And that triad, the McDonald, I think it's called triad, the arson, killing animals, and bedwetting. He had none of those.
Oh,
none.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, and neurochemistry can throw things off as well. And yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's see. You also, I saw a reference to a body book. What's that all about? Gacy's body book.
Well, on one of the visits, he pulled out this thick notebook, and I realized what it was a color-coded, tabbed catalog of all of the boys and men that were found underneath his house who are identified. And he had paid a private investigator on the outside when he was in jail to do research on all of these kids, and there were pictures of their yearbook, from their yearbook picture, there were like pictures of the family dog, the house where they grew up, Little League articles in the local newspapers, and and then chillingly, maybe the headline from a local paper when they went missing. And I said to him, like, why did you do this? And he said, well, I don't know who those kids were under my house, but I figured if I figured out some connection between them, I might be able to prove that I'm innocent, which was the biggest bunch of what.
It sounds like it was a trophy book.
It was a trophy book. It was a souvenir scrapbook of all of the killings for which, he was proud. So
was he allowed to have that in prison?
He was. You're allowed, as long as you're not, the prison kind of allows you to have pretty much anything you want that's not going to harm others. And
but a reminder of his crimes shouldn't be in there.
Yeah.
Boy.
Wow, that's
a lot
interesting.
Of stuff that goes on in prison that should go on. But
very
it
interesting.
Was a chilling. It was, and you have to remember, and your listeners have to remember, this was back, in the 80s when there was no internet where you could just Google it and print it out.
Yeah,
cut
that's
it
right.
out. So this guy had to go to like the newspapers and go through the microfiche and do all that. It was quite a bunch of work.
Yeah.
And,
so when you learned about that, what did you say to Gacy? I think I cut you off. Sorry.
Well, no, I said to him, I said, okay, this is really creepy, John, because I would talk to him like that. And I'd say, and you know what's creepiest, John? Why are you calling it a body book? I mean, these are human beings. These are boys. These are husbands and sons and brothers. And, why would you call them that? And he goes, well, what were they doing out late at night anyway? So
he rationalized his crimes.
Totally dehumanize them.
Yeah.
Because when you call someone a body, that's a commodity.
Yes.
That's like, that's how sex traffickers talk. They talk in terms of entities, not human beings.
Yeah,
and that's exactly what Gacy did.
That's right. On that series we watched, the Gacy tapes or whatever it was called, I remember at one point he said they had no right to remove those bodies. They were mine.
Yeah.
And it's like,
out of his house.
He's speaking about them as though they were a commodity that he could possess.
His trophies.
Talk about morbid.
His trophies.
Yeah. Wow.
Weird.
Oof. Hey, gross.
And did he really say something like, the only thing they really had on me is that I had a unlicensed cemetery or something similar to that kind of statement?
Yeah, he was very funny. And he told very funny jokes. And I talk in my book about why I think, comedy and humor with him was such a big part of his personality. I think it covered the dark side of him, and I think it covered who he really was. And if you are around people who have a good sense of humor, you want to be around them. They're very engaging and charming, and it's nice to laugh, and everyone likes to laugh. And I think Gacy used his humor to kind of not only just lure his victims in and get them to trust him, but when the police came knocking at his door saying, we saw a kid go in your house and now he's missing, he would make a joke or he would, deflect. And so that comment where he said, the only thing I'm guilty of is running a cemetery without a license, that was his idea of a joke.
Huh. Interesting.
Wow.
Incredible. So while he's in prison, was he kept in administrative segregation, isolation, in his own cell? Was he wasn't in the general population, I'm assuming, and did anybody try to shank him or kill him?
He, on death row, you're in your own cell for most of the day, and you have a right to go out maybe once a day. But Gacy, then you could go outside periodically. But Gacy really didn't go outside because he felt that he was in harm's way by mingling with certain of these death row inmates. But he was attacked by Henry Brisbane, who was really one of the most vicious killers on death row, and Brisbane was just an indiscriminate, just attacker. He would attack guards. He would attack other inmates for no reason. Gacy was shanked by him, and it was pretty serious, but he recovered.
Oh, okay. Going back to his modus operandi, his MO, did he it was the magic and the cuff trick and all that, but was that a part of his clown persona? Did he use that to lure and groom his victims?
No, never. No, and I don't think that would have worked, because I think a clown coming up to a 17-year-old boy was not going to work.
Okay.
So he just liked doing that in his own time. He volunteered at churches and parties and hospitals and those types of things.
So
but
he
was.
Wow. Oh, so he never used the clown. He was never dressed as a clown to pick out his next victim. Nobody ever that at a party or. Oh, so was he serious about doing the clown thing?
He loved it. It was, and I addressed this in my book, and I have some thoughts about why he did it. But I think he was a dark human being. I think he liked being somebody else for a while. I think that allowed him to be somebody behind a mask, and it was just an odd little quirk about him that he was very proud of.
Yeah, we ordered your book, and we get it tomorrow. We ordered it through Amazon. So anybody, people should order your book and definitely read it like we're going to be.
Yeah,
I can't wait to do that.
Now, I'm curious. We try to, as academics and attorneys in your case, to understand people like this. But did he ever just come right out and say, "This is why I do it. This is why I murdered them"? And did he blame it on it? Because there have been killers that you read about. They actually did their research and they read and they say, "Oh, it's all because of this." And it's like, yeah, you read that in the book, goofy. But did he ever say why he was doing it and why he was choosing?
No, he did. No, it just Gacy confessed to his first lawyer in great detail, and then after that he went silent and said he didn't do any of them. So by the time I represented him, which was 14 years after his arrest and his conviction, he never admitted to me that he did any of these things. So of course he's not going to tell me why he did something he didn't do.
Oh. Okay.
So he recanted.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he already did confessions and telling people where the bodies were, so there's no way a recant would even work. When he's already confessed where a body is and they go there and a body is there?
Yeah, and
you're talking about a professional, manipulative, sociopathic liar. So it's not surprising that he's going to lie about everything and be in denial about who he is, what he did, why he did it. That he's not going to have any self reflection or ability to do any soul searching, because there's probably not a whole lot of soul there, really.
Yeah, typically offenders, they use what we call as victimologists techniques of neutralization, but it sounds like he didn't even do that. He just went dark. Just not even talk about it, forget it, because I'm innocent and that's it, end of story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
And you said soul searching, but he went to church, didn't he?
He did, but, I think a bunch of things about that. He was raised in a very strict Catholic home. He knew, I think, at an early age that he was homosexual or bisexual, which was frowned upon horribly by the church and by his family. And so I think maybe the idea was that he wanted to associate with what he thought was upstanding morality and good things, and maybe that could cure him, of this problem that he had, because back in those days, it wasn't accepted like it is now. And I do believe that he wanted to be a priest at some point because he wasn't really attracted to women, so he thought the best thing he could do is be a priest. That, of course, didn't go anywhere. But I do think that he also wanted people to think that he was an upstanding citizen after a while. So by going to church, there's a church-going guy who's got a really good job, and he keeps a very nice house, and he does volunteer work for children, and, so he had a real appearance of morality, when on the inside he was as amoral as anybody has ever been.
Yeah, he mirrored BTK, Dennis Rader, who was a president of a Christian church.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, right.
Interesting.
I just had a thought. I never really thought about it this way before. Looking at those two, Rader and now him, because he was, especially Gacy, he was involved in politics as a leader. both nationally with the Democratic Party and with the JC civically. He was involved in his church. He was, dealing with kids with the clown thing. And so it's almost like, at first I thought that was all a part of his way of drawing victims in, but his victims were mostly related to his construction, his PDM, his company. So from what you're saying, it just hit me. He was quite possibly all these different aspects of his life that he was overachieving in, trying to look super, super good, was kind of his way of, he was overcompensating for this sense of guilt that he had.
No, I think it was being rejected by his dad. He could never please him or something like that. Is that right, Karen?
It's hard to say, but there are some psychiatrists who examined him over many, many days and tested him, and there was a thought that what he was doing when he was abducting these young men and boys was he was basically killing himself over and over again, because he had a certain type, and Gacy was he was small in stature, and so these boys were all small in stature, and he kind of exhibited like hatred of gay people and would say the most horrible things when in fact he was gay. So he was killing himself over and over again, and that makes sense to me. That there's some logic in the illogical actions, that he just hated himself and hated who he had become, and he wasn't at all, who his dad wanted him to be, and so he had to kill himself.
That's interesting.
That makes sense. So, I know that a lot of serial killers, and there's an old saying, I was in the military, and we say there are no atheists in a foxhole. A lot of folks when they're facing execution, they get very religious, and they turn to, some kind of religion and experience and relationship with their new God. Did he do that, express any remorse and turn to God, and did he express any type of emotion relative to facing execution?
Well, he never expressed remorse because he denied doing it when I was involved, and he wouldn't have expressed remorse because he didn't think what he did was wrong. He had no conscience. I don't mean to be crude here, but here was a guy who could torture someone for 2 hours, kill them, and eat a ham sandwich over their warm body.
Oh my goodness.
This was a guy who was as cold as can be. So no, he didn't have any of that stuff. Now, at the end, he didn't act like he was going to be executed. I was the one who had to break the news to him that his final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court had been denied, and he couldn't be bothered with it. And I actually pulled him aside and I said, John, this is it. You got about 3 hours left to live. I mean, are you okay? Is there anything I could do for you? And he was like, no, I'm good. I got my last meal here. I got all my friends surrounding me. I got to talk to my sister, and so he was not dealing with it on the outside. If he was dealing with it on the inside, I have no idea. He didn't act like it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that reminds me. I remember hearing something about him being manipulative, even to the very end with his last meal. The strawberries. What was that all about?
This is the most bizarre thing that ever happened. My father was a stand-up comic, which is a strange thing to be, but that's what my dad was. And during that time, my dad was living with me because he had some medical issues that I was helping him take care of. And so Gacy would call on the phone at my house at night, and my dad would talk to him. And Gacy was very funny. And one day I walked into the home, and I heard my dad say, John, what are you having for your last supper? And I could see that Gacy said, I'm not sure, Joe. What is it I should have? He goes, well, you should order fresh strawberries. And you could hear Gacy say, why fresh strawberries? And my dad said, because they're out of season. So that was the joke.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
So that was the joke. And so that caught on in the media. And sure enough, Gacy ordered fresh strawberries for his last supper. And I think it was just as a kind of a little inside joke.
Well, what I hear from that, though, I think it coincides with what, being your dad, what my daughter was trying to do for you, Gacy, is to postpone your execution. If you can't get fresh strawberries, then we're going to delay the execution. I think that's what your dad was more or less. I mean, I maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hearing from it.
But it was a joke, you know. Of course, you know they were going to delay it to get him his strawberries.
Yeah.
But it was just it was a joke. But Gacy, he took that joke and made it into reality. But that was Gacy. He had a very lively sense of humor. I mean, there's no way. I mean, listen, if they really were intent upon getting him fresh strawberries and giving him what he wanted, someone would have been on an airplane to South America to get his strawberries.
It was really creative of your dad to say that.
That's what I was just thinking. Yeah. So did they bring in Argentinian strawberries for him?
You know what? I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know what's fresh strawberries or not, or hothouse strawberries. I do know he had Kentucky Fried Chicken and French fried shrimp and Diet Coke, among other things.
Oh, really?
Oh.
And he managed like 3 KFCs, didn't he?
He did, which was really kind of creepy, too.
So kind of when his life came full circle there on that one.
Right.
Yeah, what about the execution? Were you present then at the execution?
No, I wanted to be because I believed as his lawyer I should be entitled to be with him at every step of the way. And in our criminal justice system, as you know, you're entitled to a lawyer during interrogation, during the trial, during appeals. And in Illinois, that just wasn't the case. So there was a lottery of all things where the media and different people could put your, put your name in, and then they randomly picked people to be there present at the execution. Not even the victims' families got to be there. So, no, I wasn't there for the execution.
Wow. That really surprises me that the victim's family couldn't be there back then. Huh.
Yeah.
So somebody from Chicago Times could be there, but you couldn't.
Exactly. Yeah, we had some media people in Chicago, USA Today, won the lottery, and it didn't seem fair. I think there was a closed, video for the victims' families, but if you can imagine this, how many victims' family members were there, I mean, he killed 33, so there were a lot of people there.
So for comparison, it's not like that today? Because I don't know how.
No, we don't have the death penalty. We don't have the death penalty in Illinois. It's been abolished.
Yeah, pretty recently too. Like what, 3-4 years ago?
2011.
Oh, that long ago. All right. Yeah, Minnesota doesn't have it. They actually talked about it. Reinstating it with Drew Shadeen and the fellow that killed her. There was talk, but it didn't go anywhere. Did Gacy ever thank you?
Yes.
He did?
Yeah, profusely. Mm-hmm. Huh. He was very, he said the words, right? So whether he had the ability to express true gratefulness and thanks, I doubt it, but he certainly said it, and that was, it's in my book. I probably don't want to talk about it. It's something that I would like your listeners to read. That was one of the last things he did, and it was very touching if you believed that what he was doing was real, and if not, what he did was what was socially appropriate. And but it was very difficult, and this is something that's really hard to describe and explain. People say he's such a horrible person, he's evil, like how could you be upset when he was executed? Well, when you know somebody, when you experience somebody's humanity, regardless of whether they beat their wife, they poison their dog, they, kick their kids, whatever people do that's evil, they're still a human being. And when you know that somebody is going to be executed at a certain date and a certain time, I mean, that never happens. And your first inclination is to call the authorities, but the authorities are the ones who are doing it. So It's just confusing and it's upsetting. And Gacy had family there at the end who were sobbing, who loved him unconditionally, and friends who knew him for years and knew what he did, but still, were going to mourn his loss. So this was very confusing to me and very upsetting to lose a case like this and to lose a human being.
Yeah. Well, it just proves that you have a loving heart, is what that is. A caring, loving person.
It's like that's part of being a human being, to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Is to not want others to die, right? Like Gacy
Yes.
is the opposite. Like he wanted people to die. He wanted to kill them. That's not a normal human urge. I think a normal human urge is to fight to stay alive and not to hurt and kill other people. That's
Right.
truly what I believe.
Yeah, that reminds me.
It seems to be a normal thing to care about people you don't even know. Like we get involved in a lot of missing person cases. We don't know them. We've never met them, but yet we're caring and loving to try to help them with our own money.
And you hear a lot of people. I could take them out and shoot them. I could. Why keep them alive?
Right.
If you know somebody, it's different. It's just different.
It's all about.
When you touch someone's hand, when you look in their eye, you know they have children, you know they have loved ones, you know that they're not harming anybody. It's hard to say, I could take you out and kill you. To me, that's like offensive to my moral code.
Yeah, it's social construction of reality. When someone like Gacy does it, it's murder and it's killing. But when the state does it, it all of a sudden becomes execution.
Yeah.
Try to soften it and make it justified. You mentioned he was selling his paintings. I thought we had a law, at least nowadays, that you can't profit from your crime. He was selling paintings?
Yeah, people get this wrong, and they call it the Son of Sam law and all that stuff. Those laws were almost all stricken down as unconstitutional because even a prisoner has the ability to paint and to write and to do all of these things. Now, if part of their parole might be that they can't profit from their crimes, so be it. And so that keeps them from profiting from their crimes. And that's why family members sometimes bring these lawsuits, because if there's any profit, then the families get it, and the criminal doesn't get to profit from the crimes. But no, Gacy was free to do what he wanted to do, and he was free to sell his artwork. But the way the prison got around it was to sue him for the cost of incarceration, which I talked about earlier.
Oh. Now, where did his artwork end up? Private hands or a gallery? Or
It's all over the place. If you go on eBay right now, I think you can buy some of his artwork. I have three of them that he gave me for my birthday that I talk about in my book. It's just horrific looking stuff too. It's just not. I wouldn't even call it art, to tell you the truth. It's just clowns and skulls, and it's just creepy stuff.
Wow. Alrighty. Now there's another thing here, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on this, because at one point there's like a 1,300-day gap in the beginning, and when he starts killing, do you think are there more victims out there that we don't know about? And,
yes,
and are there
are
any cases that present day law enforcement officers, investigators, are looking at in other
active
areas?
cases?
Yeah, that are open cases, they're cold cases, and they think, well, maybe he did this one too. Are there any of those out there?
I don't really know. I do hear all the time that people who had family members gone missing during that time, think that Gacy may have been the perpetrator. Gacy, I do believe, had other victims. I know that he took business trips to different states, including Wisconsin and Florida and the Pacific Northwest, and he was doing construction jobs there. I've seen his business records that verify that he was out of town, and my guess is that he did not stop his killing spree while he was gone. In fact, it would have been easier where people didn't know him and were less populated areas than where he lived. So I don't know. We didn't have an integrated database at that time for missing persons like we do now.
Mm-hmm.
But my thought is that if some aggressive podcaster or sleuther could go and look at the records of where Gacy was at certain times and who went missing during that time period, maybe there could be some dots connected, but I don't think anybody's actively doing that.
Actually, we want to do it because we heard you talking about it.
Yeah.
So I think we're gonna adopt that, and at least try to see if we can dig and get information.
And the other thing that you have to remember, our sheriff actually opened up a file a few years back and said, listen, there are a few Gacy victims that were never identified that were under his house, and he was welcoming family members to give DNA so they could try to figure out who these young men were. And one of the things that the sheriff noted, and he was really right, was that during that time period, a lot of families who may have suspected that Gacy killed their son didn't come forward because of the shame of being gay. Wow. And, back then, like I said, it was a whole different world, and some of these family members would rather not go public with the idea that their son may have been a runaway, may have, been engaging in sex for money. Not all of them were prostitutes, but some of them were. So, that made it difficult, too, to identify some of these victims.
Right. Through my investigations of you, to get to know your background, I ran into what you're talking about. The Cook County Sheriff, Thomas J. Dart, has on their website 5 unidentified victims that were found at his house,
yep,
that they're trying to identify.
Right.
So there are forms to fill out. If anybody listening feels that they have a connection possibly to the case, you can go again to the Cook County Sheriff's Office and fill out forms
and that's
there.
Good. And what I do want to also tell your listeners who may be interested in doing this is that at least several of the victims were kids from other states who would take a bus to Chicago maybe to find a job or what have you. And so Gacy would troll the Greyhound bus station and get these kids coming off the buses so that these kids may have been from Chicago area, but they could be from other states as well.
Okay.
So, and our sheriff, Dart, is doing a really good and compassionate job here. So I think if you have that inclination, do it because it's being handled very, very compassionately.
Yeah, no, I am going to adopt that and at least try. Use my paralegal litigation skill set and see if we get anywhere.
Yeah. For folks who are listening and they want to do that, from what I know, I've done work with the NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Another really good, states all have their own databases too, but there's also NAMUS, National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS. So there's those two databases that they can access. So you do believe he definitely has other victims, or there's a really good potential for that?
I do. And, unfortunately, Gacy's no longer with us to tell us that, and we may never identify them, but it just seems that he didn't stop doing what he was doing. He was very prolific, and because he was out of town, like I said, where kids would, be more trusting, where there was more, more rural areas, it just defies logic that he wouldn't have continued his crime spree in those areas.
Yeah, we looked at, what was it, Kimmy, the I-65, I-70 killer, 2 different major highways, and his pattern, and I think they're looking at that. I think we're missing some victims there as well. We did a podcast on that one. Do you think Gacy, this is a lot of murdered people. Did Gacy do this by himself, or did he have accomplices or accomplices?
I believe he had accomplices. There were 2 young men living with him at the time, at the very end there, and they were working for him. They were taking drugs from him. They were drinking. They were getting money from him, and they testified that they dug the trenches. So to me, they obviously knew why they were digging the trenches, and I cannot believe that Gacy could have lugged those bodies down by himself, lined them up like little toy soldiers, and buried them there without help. There's just no way. And there was at least 1 victim, and maybe 2, who told the police these kids escaped Gacy's torture. And they both said to the police that there were other perpetrators doing bad things to them while it was going on. So my guess is that those young men were involved in procuring the young men and boys, tying them up, perpetrating the crimes and definitely disposing of the bodies.
Oh, boy. Huh.
It's terrible.
And did they go to prison?
No, they testified against Gacy, and they got immunity.
Oh.
So one of them committed suicide after Gacy was convicted, and the other one is still residing in the Chicagoland area.
Oh. So they went state's evidence then.
Yes, and, I think the prosecutor just wanted to tie this up with a bow. Go for the serial killer world record, which was
Sure.
at the time, and didn't want to complicate the case with these two young men. And I'm not, I think Gacy groomed them, and this is not unheard of with serial killers, where you groom people to help you procure, and then once the kids get involved in this stuff, they now are complicit, and now they can't tell on Gacy because they've actually committed crimes too. And so you got kids from kind of broken homes who need money or maybe homeless, and you got Gacy who's providing them with all these things that their family's not providing them, and now they're sucked into this life of crime. And I'm sure that's what happened here with Gacy's roommates.
Wow. Oh, wow. I can't wait to read the book and find out what's in between the lines of what we're talking about.
Yeah, we get it tomorrow.
Incredible. Did Gacy, what do you say about you and your future? I mean, he had to know that he was going to be famous at this point. What did he say about you?
I mean, famous. He was famous for 14 years while he was in prison, so he was famous. I mean, everyone knew his name. He did tell me that I was always going to be associated with him, and that's probably true because 30 years later, after his execution, people are still talking about it. And in my book, Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, is bringing this up again. And unfortunately, I've always had this book in me, but I waited a long time to write it because I just wanted to be done with that part of my life. I don't do this kind of work anymore. But I finally kind of looked back at my career and said, you know what, I think it's empowering to talk about something that you've done because you feel strongly about it. It's a pivotal point in my life. It's a point where I stood up against the system. I became a more resilient person, a more confident person, and it really helped my career in the long run because I developed skills in media and developed skills in dealing with people and being a better lawyer. And so in the long run, handling the Gacy case was a gift.
Yes. Yeah, and you definitely have a story to tell that no other attorney really has. No one, it's very rare for people to represent someone like this.
Yeah, I was his only female lawyer, too, which added another layer that's in my book about being treated differently as a female, especially back 30 years ago. And that's another part of my book that I think
I'm going to be very interested to read that, yes.
Yeah. Now, for our listeners, on what day was John Wayne Gacy executed?
May 10th, 1994.
Yeah, so we're coming up, like you said, on the 30th anniversary.
Right.
Very interesting. Let's see. In researching your history, my wife, Rev Kimmy, worked several times at Robert Shapiro's office in Century City. And during the time
law
of the
firm Glazer Wheel.
Yeah, famous for the O.J. Simpson criminal case. You have some ties with O.J.'s case, don't you?
With Bob.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, about 30 days after Gacy was executed, O.J. Simpson took the drive in his Bronco. So I started doing a lot of commentary for CNN and the other cable stations about O.J. Simpson. That's how I got to be a legal analyst and a radio show host. And during that time, during the trial, my law partner and I decided to host a mock closing argument. What we did was we got jury selectors and jury consultants to come in, and we had invited people to come, and we voir them, and we put them in a panel, and we had jurors sitting on a panel, and we gave our closing arguments to the jury, and then we videotaped the deliberations. And they came back, with a verdict, and so that made national news. So Bob Shapiro, who wanted to, see what maybe the jurors are thinking about, because, that case went on for 9 months, he wanted to get a copy of it. So we sent him a copy. We sent Marcia Clark a copy as well. And as a result, we developed, an acquaintanceship, and I wouldn't say a friendship, but when he came into town in Chicago, and we put him on our radio show, and actually he endorsed my book. So if your listeners buy the book, you will see Robert Shapiro's endorsement on the front cover.
Wow. So you did voir dire and the whole 9 yards. There's your next book. That would be interesting reading, too.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. Did it conclude the same way the real trial concluded? Your mock trial?
We only gave them an hour to deliberate, and it was a hung jury.
Oh. Okay.
But it'd be really interesting to see how the different jurors, what was their background, and did they look at the case this way versus that way? And because I remember when the verdict was read, I was working on my master's, and when I went to the day room, or whatever you want to call it, to watch the students' reactions, it was all over the board. There were folks that were pro-OJ, there were folks that were against him, and I really thought a fight was going to break out in the room. But as you looked around the room, you could not stereotype and say that, here's a white male or a black male, and he's an athlete, and so he's going to be pro OJ. No, it wasn't that way. It just completely threw me off, and that's what got me hooked on being a sociologist and going for my PhD.
Really?
Yeah.
That's funny because I was at a law firm. I've been in law, civil law for 30 years, right?
Yeah.
And trials and stuff like that. And it's funny that you say that. The perspective of maybe like you're focused on the jurors, but at the law firm, when that came down, the verdict, the attorneys in the office were blaming Marcia.
Oh.
Uh-huh. So it's all perspective, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, there's your next book.
Yeah, definitely. We'll read that one, too.
You write that one, Karen. I'll read it. I'll go buy it. Speaking of that...
I think I'm going to do a novel next time.
Oh, okay.
I think I'm going to do something less real. I like that idea.
Well, we'll read that, too.
You bet. So, for our listeners, the name of the book, again, is Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, Defending America's Most Evil Serial Killer on Death Row, and the author is Karen Conti, C-O-N-T-I. You Google that. Back in the day, we had to go to the card catalog. But
and I know it's available on Amazon because I purchased it yesterday. And where else? Do you know where else they can buy it?
Yeah.
Books A Million, Walmart, your bookstores, and it's also available on Audible, and I'm the one reading it.
Oh, okay. And where else can our listeners find you on social media to follow you?
You can go to KarenConti.com, KarenConti, on Facebook and Instagram, at KarenConti23. And, I'm all over the place. I have a radio show on WGN in Chicago, so if you Google WGN Karen Conti, you'll find all my podcasted segments where I host a 2-hour legal talk show, and I'm all over the place.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Karen. It was
Thank you for
pleasure
having me.
Chatting with you about this, and we'll sign off now. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Dr. G, Rev Kimmy, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was a most interesting interview. That was our special guest, Karen Conti, an attorney that represented the infamous killer clown John Wayne Gacy in his final appeal before he was executed almost 30 years ago, May 10th. Any closing comments or thoughts, Rev Kimmy?
No, I just can't read. I can't wait to read the book. Get it tomorrow.
Yep.
We'll learn a lot more than what we did today.
We'll have to have more special guests like this. That was really fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and we will talk to you again on another episode. God bless you.
God bless.